King Cotton ruled Mississippi, and during its reign, Mississippi prospered.
It's important to recognize the sheer wealth that the South's economy had. By 1860, the South, not the United States, but the South had the fourth largest economy in the world. And that was largely due to its production of cotton.
Cotton in 1860 was the nation's most valuable export item. More valuable than steel, more valuable than manufactured goods. Cotton was the one thing that Americans made that the rest of the world wanted. And Mississippi was the nation's leading cotton producer. So it was a wealthy state.
It is literally a gold mine. Cotton seemed to flourish in the climate, and so it transformed the lives of many, particularly white men and their families, and so it became a very plantation-rich environment.
A plantation well stocked with hands is a ne plus ultra of every man's ambition who resides in the South. Young men who come to this country to make money soon catch the mania, and nothing less than a broad plantation waving with snow-white cotton balls can fill their mental vision. Mississippi author Joseph Holt Ingram.
King Cotton ruled Mississippi, and during its reign, Mississippi prospered.
It's important to recognize the sheer wealth that the South's economy had. By 1860, the South, not the United States, but the South had the fourth largest economy in the world. And that was largely due to its production of cotton.
Cotton in 1860 was the nation's most valuable export item. More valuable than steel, more valuable than manufactured goods. Cotton was the one thing that Americans made that the rest of the world wanted. And Mississippi was the nation's leading cotton producer. So it was a wealthy state.
It is literally a gold mine. Cotton seemed to flourish in the climate.
This has been the journey to get here to Bertrand Russell. I came across an article from someone that had posted something about flat earth, strangely enough. That's one thing I do like about flat earthers. They do tend to lift up stones in areas of investigation where other people tend not to. But it was from Old Thinker News, possibly a right-wing paper. I don't know much about them, but they talked about the biological warfare against us, and there's a book, Your Health, Your Sanity in the Age of Treason, which talks about Bertrand Russell and Fichte on the impact of sciences on society. Now, if you looked at any of my videos on social engineering, we've basically just come full circle. Because I'm hardly into this book, chapter 2. I really was just browsing, because in the other book by the doctor, whose name has completely escaped me at the moment, sorry, I'll tell you in a moment, he talks about the fact that the education is going to be dumbing us down. And Bertrand Russell has written his book on the society of impact of sciences on society, where they talk about the methodology that they're going to be using to be able to achieve this. And we've actually just kind of come full circle, because it's very much about us, even though the doctor is complaining about things like fluoride, and this is in 1958. So there have been people that are out there warning us, but again, as I said, here we go, because I'm hardly into this book, and this is talking about us. So science, ever since the time of the Arabs, has had two functions. One, to enable us to know things, and two, to enable us to do things. The Greeks, with the exception of Archimedes, were only interested in the first of these. They had much curiosity about the world, but since civilized people lived comfortably on slave labor, they had no interest in technique. Interested in the practical uses of science came first through superstition and magic. The Arabs wished to discover the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, and how to transmute base metals into gold. In pursuing investigations having these purposes, they discovered many factors in chemistry, but they did not arrive at any valid and important general laws, and their technique remained elementary. However, in the late Middle Ages, two discoveries were made which had a profound importance. They were gunpowder and the mariner's compass. It is not known who made these discoveries. The only thing certain is that it was not Roger Bacon. Now, in fact, when you go into that book about the Americas being the first continent by Aldous, names are escaping me right now, but he says the same thing. And in fact, I was trying to find in the book where he was saying that the technology for boats and sailing was actually stolen from the Phoenicians when they lost a war. Now let's bear in mind the information that we've been looking at. Clearly we were at war with people and they took this technology from us, and this was a while back. Now so we've got gunpowder. That was the only reason why they were able to beat us, so they say. Enabled central governments to subdue rebellious barons. Magna Carta would have never been won if John had possessed artillery. But although in this instance we may side with the barons against the king, in general the Middle Ages suffered from anarchy, and what was needed was a way of establishing order and respect for law. And we can see this in the videos that I'm doing at this current moment about the white slaves in England. At that time, only royal power could achieve this. The barons had depended upon their castles, which could not stand against guns. That is why the Tudors were more powerful than earlier kings. And the same kind of change occurred at the same time in France and Spain. The modern power of the state began in the late 15th century and began as a result of gunpowder. From that day to this, the authority of the states has increased, and throughout it has been mainly improvement in weapons. This development was begun by Henry, what's that? Stupid Roman numerals. I think it's the 6th or the 5th, and Louis the 10th or the 11th. And Ferdinand and Isabella. I know someone will correct me with that. It was artillery that enabled them to succeed. The mariner's compass was equally important. It made possible the age of discovery. The New World, our world, was opened to white colonists. The routes to the east around Cape of Good Hope made possible the conquest of India, and brought about important contracts between Europe and China. The importance of sea power was enormously increased, and through sea power Western Europe came to dominate the world. It is only in the present century that this domination has come to an end. Nothing of equal importance occurred in the way of new scientific technique until the age of steam and the Industrial Revolution. The atom bomb has caused many people during the last 7 years to think that scientific technique may be carried too far, but there is nothing new in this. The Industrial Revolution caused unspeakable misery both in England and in America. I do not think any student of economic history can doubt that the average of happiness in England in the early 19th century was lower than it had been in 100 years earlier, and this was due mostly entirely to scientific technique. Let us consider cotton, which was the most important example of early industrialization. In the Lancashire cotton mills, from which Marx and Engels derived their livelihood, children worked from 12 to 16 hours a day. They often began working at the age of 6 or 7, which is exactly what I'm going through right now. Children had to be beaten to keep them from falling asleep while at work. In spite of this, many failed to keep awake and rolled into the machinery, by which they were mutilated or killed. Parents had to submit to the infliction of these atrocities upon their children, because they themselves were in desperate plight. Handicraftsmen had been thrown out of work by the machines. Rural labourers were compelled to migrate to the towns by the Enclosure Act, which used Parliament to make landowners richer by making peasants destitute. Trade unions were illegal until 1824. The government employed agent provocateurs to try to get revolutionary sentiment out of wage earners, who were then deported or hanged. And this is exactly what we were hearing today when we were listening to A1 and Acid Duke of Tears, when they were saying, you know, when you really consider and you look at these pictures of these people who have been lynched and hung, it was very much about the people who knew their rights, had land, had property, knew exactly what was going on, and were fighting against it. Such were the first effects of machinery in England. Meanwhile, the effects in the United States had been equally disastrous. At the time of the War of Independence, here we go, and for some years after its close, the southern states were quite well willing to contemplate the abolition of slavery in the near future. Slavery in the North and West were abolished by a unanimous vote in 1787, and Jefferson, not without reason, hoped to see it abolished in the South. But in the year of 1793, Whitney invented the cotton gin, which enabled a Negro to clean 50 pounds of fibre a day instead of only 1 as formerly. Labour-saving devices in England had caused children to have to work 15 hours a day. Labour-saving devices in America inflicted upon slaves a life of toil far more severe than what they had to endure before Mr. Whitney's invention. The slave trade having been abolished in 1808, the immense increase in the cultivation of cotton after that date had to be made possible by importing Negroes from the less southerly states in which cotton could not be grown. The deep South was unhealthy, and the slaves on the cotton plantations were cruelly overworked. The less southern slave states thus became breeding grounds for the profitable southern graveyards. A particularly revolting aspect of the traffic was that a white man who owned female slaves could beget children by them who were his slaves, and whom, when he needed cash, he could sell to the plantation, to become, in all likelihood, victims of hookworm, malaria, or yellow fever. Now, let's not forget that, because while I'm actually reading this, I'm uploading a video about infanticide in England, and these were the people that they were sending over here. So listen carefully and listen with discernment. Right. Because this is this is exactly what these guys are doing. They're coming over here, having children with the original women, and then selling these children with no care or concern, because this is an environment that they have been brought up in. It's been going on in England for such a long time. I think by the time they get sent here, these people are psychopaths, because generationally they have been born clearly out of nothing but neglect. So the ultimate outcome was the Civil War, which would most certainly not have occurred if the cotton industry had remained unscientific. There were also results in other continents. Cotton goods could find a market in India and Africa. This was a stimulus to British imperialism. Africa had to be taught that nudity is wicked. This was done very cheaply by missionaries. In addition to cotton goods, we exported tuberculosis and syphilis, but for them there was no charge. Alright, so here we go. When we say that the dashikis come from the Dutch, people don't want to believe us, but cotton comes from here. And as part of spreading industry, they wanted to put clothes on the Africans. I have dwelt upon the case of cotton because I want to emphasize that evils due to a new scientific technique are no new thing. The evils I have been speaking of ceased in time. Child labor was abolished in England. Slavery was abolished in America. Imperialism is now at an end in India. The evils that persist in Africa have now nothing to do with cotton. Steam, which was one of the most important elements in the Industrial Revolution, had its most distinctive sphere of operation in transport, steamers and railways. The really large-scale effects of steam transportation did not develop fully till after the middle of the 19th century, when they led to the opening of the Middle West of America and the use of its grain to feed the industrial populations of England and New England. Because why? When we read in White Slaves of England, they were starving. This led to a very general increase of prosperity and had more to do than any other single cause with Victorian optimism. It made possible a very rapid increase in population in every civilized country except France, where the Code Napoleon had prevented it by decreeing equal division of a man's property among all his children, and where a majority were peasant proprietors owning very little land. This development was not attended with the evils of early industrialism, chiefly, I think, because of the abolition of slavery and the growth of democracy. Irish peasants and Russian serfs, who were not self-governing, continued to suffer. Cotton operatives would have continued to suffer if English landowners had not been strong enough to defeat Cobden and Bright. There we go. Complete full circle. But really, was Cobden and Bright defeated? Because at the end of the day we still ended up with free trade, and we still ended up with universal suffrage. So the next important stage in the development of scientific technique is connected with electricity and oil and the internal combustion engine. Long before the use of electricity as a source of power, it was used in the telegraph. This had two important consequences. First, messages could now travel faster than human beings. Secondly, in large organizations, detailed control from a center became much more possible than it had formerly been. In fact, the fact that messages could travel faster than human beings was useful, above all to the police. Before the telegraph, a highwayman on a galloping horse could escape to a place where his crime had not yet been heard of, and this made it very much harder to catch him. Unfortunately, however, the men whom the police wish to catch are frequently benefactors of mankind. If the telegraph had existed, Polycrates would have caught Pythagoras, the Athenian government would have caught Anaxagoras, the Pope would have caught William of Ockham, and Pitt would have caught Tom Paine when he fled to France in 1792. A large portion of the best Germans and Russians have suffered under Hitler and Stalin. Many more would have escaped but for the rapid transmission of messages. The increased power of the police, therefore, is not wholly a gain. Increase of central control is an even more important consequence of the telegraph. In ancient empires, satraps or proconsuls in distant provinces could rebel and had time to entrench themselves before the central government knew of their disaffection. When Constantine proclaimed himself emperor at York and marched on Rome, he was almost under the walls of the city before the Roman authorities knew he was coming. Perhaps if the telegraph had existed in those days, the Western world would not now be Christian. In the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans was fought after peace had been concluded, but neither army was aware of the fact. Before the telegraph, ambassadors had an independence which they have now completely lost, because they had to be allowed a free hand if swift action was necessary in a crisis. So we've seen two big bits of information there about America. It was not only in relation to government, but wherever organizations covering large areas were concerned, that the telegraph effected a transformation. Read, for instance, in Hakluyt's Voyages, the accounts of attempts to foster trade with Russia that were made by English commercial interests in the time of Elizabeth. All that could be done was to choose an energetic and tactful emissary, give him letters, goods, money, and leave him to make what headway he could. Contract with his employer was possible only at long intervals, and their instructions could never be up to date. The effect of the telegraph was to increase the power of the central government and diminish the initiative of distant subordinates. This applied not only to the state, but to every geographically extensive organization. We shall find that a great deal of scientific technique has a similar effect. The result is that fewer men have executive power, but those few have more power than such men had formerly. In all these respects, broadcasting has completed what the telegraph began.